The silence descended upon Kingsley's like a physical thing, a heavy velvet curtain dropping suddenly onto a stage. One moment, the grand dining room was a symphony of discreet, expensive sounds. The gentle clinking of Christopher silverware against Bernardad porcelain, the low murmur of conversations about acquisitions and Aspen ski trips, the soft, melancholic notes of a Debussy piece flowing from the grand piano in the corner. The next, there was nothing. 100 conversations ceased. Mid-sentence forks laden with seared foie gras froze halfway to exquisitely lipsticked mouths. The pianist's fingers hovered, trembling over the ivory keys. In that vacuum, every eye in Manhattan's most exclusive and unforgiving restaurant fixed on the small, impossible drama unfolding in the space between the tables. 10-year-old Lucas Montgomery was shaking. It was not the violent tremor of a seizure, but the fine, high-frequency vibration of a soul stretched taut with a terrifying mixture of hope and fear. His thin legs, encased in the gleaming, unforgiving steel of his leg braces, wavered on the plush Oberson carpet. His small hand, pale and determined, was outstretched. It was aimed at Diana Johnson, the restaurant's only black waitress, a woman who, until this exact moment, had been a master of the fine art of being invisible. The boy's impulse had been a lightning strike from a clear blue sky. The piano had shifted from a somber adagio to a soft, lilting melody, a waltz that spoke of ballrooms and forgotten romances. And Lucas, who had not initiated a single voluntary movement in a public space in 2 long years, had pushed himself up from his chair and asked a waitress to dance. "Sir, control your son." The voice of Mr. Thornton, the restaurant's manager, was a knife, sharp and cold, slicing through the thick, shocked silence. He materialized at the table, his face a mask of horrified apology aimed squarely at the boys. "Father, that is grossly inappropriate. This is not a dance hall, and our employees are certainly not here to entertain children." Richard Montgomery, owner of Montgomery Investments, a titan of industry whose net worth was discussed in the same hushed, reverent tones as the GDP of a small nation, felt a hot, familiar shame crawl up his neck. He swallowed the knot in his throat hard and painful. This was the first time he had risked taking Lucas out to a public dinner since the accident that had shattered his son's legs and his own carefully ordered world. A mistake, he thought, with a surge of cold fury that he would not be repeating. "Lucas, sit down." The order was a low growl, each word a stone dropped into the silent pool of the room. Diana Johnson remained motionless. Her gaze, dark and unreadable, shifted from the apoplectic manager to the powerful, humiliated billionaire, and finally, to the small, trembling boy whose hand was still hanging in the air between them, a question mark of hope. In her 5 years at Kingsley's, she had learned the survival skills of her trade. She knew how to become part of the scenery, to anticipate the needs of the powerful before they were even articulated, to absorb their casual cruelties and their thoughtless condescensions with a mask of serene professionalism. She was an expert in invisibility, but tonight, Lucas Montgomery had seen her. "Mr. Thornton, I am leaving now. My shift is over." Her voice was a calm, quiet counterpoint to the storm of tension in the room. With a single fluid motion, she untied the crisp white apron from around her waist and placed it, folded, onto the silver tray she held. Then, to the collective, audible gasp of the entire dining room, she turned to the boy. A slow, beautiful smile bloomed on her face, a smile of such genuine warmth and acceptance that it seemed to light the space around her. She took Lucas's small, outstretched hand in her own. "I can't dance in an apron," she said simply, as if this were the most normal thing in the world. Richard Montgomery shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous thunder. Diana held his gaze, her own calm and unwavering. There was no fear in her eyes, only a quiet, profound certainty. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." Before anyone could move, before the manager could interject or the father could issue another command, Lucas took a step. It was a small, hesitant, agonizingly difficult movement. His right foot, locked within its steel cage, dragged painfully across the floor. The metal of the brace made a faint high-pitched screech against the polished wood, a sound that seemed to pierce the heart of every person in the room. But Diana did not pull. She did not try to guide him or hurry him or correct his form. She simply adjusted her own pace to his, her body becoming a mirror to his struggle, a partner in his effort. "She's getting fired tomorrow," whispered a woman. At the next table, a real estate mogul's third wife, her face a mask of horrified glee. Can you imagine the audacity? Richard watched, paralyzed. He was no longer in Kingsley's He was in his own living room, 2 years, a lifetime, ago. The air was filled with the scent of his wife's perfume and the sound of her laughter. Elizabeth was dancing with a younger, whole Lucas, her arms around him, his small feet on top of hers. He had been clumsy then, too, tripping over his own unbraced legs, but his laughter had been free and joyous. "It's not about perfection, darling," Elizabeth's voice echoed in his memory, a ghost in the silent dining room. "It's about the connection. It's about letting him lead, even if he doesn't know the steps." As Diana followed Lucas's clumsy, shuffling movements, a miracle occurred. Something in the boy's eyes, something in the set of his jaw, changed. The terror that had been his constant companion for 2 years began to recede. The deep, pervasive shame that colored his every interaction with the world began to dissipate. In its place, a look of intense, fierce concentration took hold. For the first time since the accident, he was not being helped. He was not being guided, or corrected, or pitied. He was leading. He was the one setting the pace. He was, for 3 glorious, painful, beautiful steps, in control. Mr. Montgomery, the manager's voice, now frantic, interrupted his thoughts. "I can assure you, sir, this will never, ever happen again. She will be properly and severely disciplined." Richard did not respond. He couldn't. The entire restaurant seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for his verdict. He was Richard Montgomery. His power was absolute. He could, with a single, quiet word to the manager, end this woman's career, not just at Kingsley's, but at any fine dining establishment in the city. The employees stood frozen, their faces pale. The other customers watched with a morbid, ravenous curiosity, hungry for the drama. But the only thing Richard could hear, the only thing that registered in his stunned, reeling mind, was the sound of his son's smile. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears, but he felt it. He saw it, a small, shy but undeniably real smile of pure, unadulterated pride. After 3 more shuffling, screeching, triumphant steps, Diana gently guided the boy back to his table. She bent down slightly, so that she was at his eye level. "Thank you for asking me to dance, Lucas," she said, her voice formal and respectful, as if she were speaking not to a child, but to a gentleman. "It was an honor." She turned to leave, her face once again a mask of professional neutrality. But before she could take a step, Richard's voice stopped her. Wait. His own voice sounded different to him. It was rough, unfamiliar, stripped of its usual layers of command and control. It was the voice of a man who had just been shaken to his very foundation. "What is your full name?" "Diana Johnson, sir." "Diana Johnson," he repeated, the name feeling strange and important on his tongue, as if he were memorizing it for a vital purpose. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, his hand fumbling for a moment, and pulled out a thick, heavy business card. He held it out to her. "My office, tomorrow, 10 o'clock in the morning." The entire restaurant collectively held its breath again. This was the twist no one had seen coming. Diana accepted the card, her expression still unreadable, but Richard saw, with a strange sense of satisfaction, that her hand, the same hand that had held his son's with such steady, gentle strength, was trembling almost imperceptibly. "Dad," Lucas called out as Diana walked away, her footsteps silent on the thick carpet. "Why did you do that?" The question, simple and direct, hung in the air between them. It was not just a question, it was an accusation. It was the question of a son who had, for 2 long years, been treated as a problem to be managed, a project to be fixed, a source of his father's frustration and disappointment. Richard looked at his son, truly looked at him, and for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, he saw not just the broken, fragile child that his grief had allowed him to see, but the complete, complex, courageous human being that Elizabeth had left in his care. He saw a boy whose wants and needs, whose fears and desires, he had systematically, and perhaps unforgivably, ignored that as their dinner proceeded in a new, awkward, and profoundly changed silence. No one in the restaurant noticed the final glance. Diana gave the room before she disappeared through the service doors. It was not a glance of fear, or of triumph, or of resignation. It was a look of quiet, steely determination, the look of a strategist who has just successfully executed the opening move in a long and complex campaign. It was a look that contrasted sharply with the emotional storm that was just beginning to brew in the eyes of Richard Montgomery. The lobby of Montgomery Tower was a cathedral of modern capitalism. The walls were clad in vast, seamless sheets of glass and Italian marble, reflecting the bright morning sun and the ceaseless, frantic energy of Manhattan. The air was cool, still, and smelled faintly of success. Diana Johnson, in her best and only interview outfit, a simple navy blue skirt and a crisp white blouse she had bought on sale at a department store, felt immediately, profoundly out of place. The people who strode past her, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor, wore clothes that cost more than her monthly rent. They moved with an easy, unthinking confidence. The confidence of people who had never had to wonder if their card would be declined. "Diana Johnson to see Mr. Montgomery," she said to the receptionist, a blonde woman with a surgically perfect nose and a gaze as cold and clinical as a medical instrument. The receptionist examined Diana from head to toe, her assessment lasting a fraction of a second too long, before she made the call. 18th floor, Miss Winters will see you." In the silent wood-paneled elevator that whisked her upwards at a dizzying speed, Diana took a deep, steadying breath. She clutched her worn leather purse to her chest like a shield. It wasn't fear. She felt it was a familiar, cold resolve. This was enemy territory, and she had been preparing for this battle for a very long time. Miss Winters, a woman in her 40s with a brutally sharp haircut and a posture that could have been used to test plumb lines, met her at the elevator bank. "Mr. Montgomery is on a conference call," she said, her voice as crisp and starched as her blouse. "Please, follow me." As they walked through the hushed, minimalist hallways, Diana felt the weight of a dozen curious stares. The employees, all of them young, all of them white, looked up from their computers as she passed. A black woman being personally escorted through the executive offices of Montgomery Investments was an anomaly, a rare and noteworthy event, and speculation flickered in their eyes. When they were alone in a small, sterile waiting room with a single, uncomfortable-looking chair, Miss Winters turned to her. "He had you fired, didn't he?" she asked, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. It wasn't a question, it was a statement. Diana said nothing. "It happens," Winters continued, a strange, bitter sympathy in her eyes. "A powerful client like Mr. Montgomery calls the restaurant manager, makes a complaint, and people like you lose their jobs. It's the way the world works." "People like me?" Diana asked, her voice quiet. "You know what I mean," Winters said, adjusting the glasses on her nose. "Employees who don't know their place." Diana smiled, a slow, humorless curving of her lips. "And where exactly would that be, Miss Winters?" Before the assistant could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it. "He'll see you now." Richard Montgomery's office occupied half of the entire floor. The floor-to-ceiling windows on three sides made it feel as if you were floating in the sky, a god looking down on the distant, toy-like playground of Manhattan. Richard stood with his back to her, gazing out at the city as if it were his personal property, a kingdom he had built with his own two hands. "Mr. Montgomery," Diana said, her voice formal and steady. Richard turned. His face was a mask of cool, studied control. The emotional turmoil of the previous night was gone, locked away behind a facade of impenetrable power. "Miss Johnson," he said, "thank you for coming." He gestured towards a single, stark leather chair positioned in front of his massive desk. "Please." The silence that followed was a tactic, a weapon. Diana recognized it immediately. It was the silence designed to make the other person uncomfortable, to make them nervous, to make them talk too much, to make them incriminate themselves. She waited, her own silence a quiet act of defiance. "Do you have a background?" Richard finally asked, his voice casual. "Excuse me, an education." "College," he clarified. Diana kept her gaze steady, refusing to be intimidated. "A bachelor's degree in child development from NYU, she stated, and an incomplete master's degree in special education. Something flickered across Richard's face. Surprise, perhaps. It was a small crack in his composure. "And you work as a waitress?" "I work 3 jobs, actually," she replied, her voice even. "A restaurant, a bookstore on the weekends, and I work as a private tutor for children with learning disabilities. When I can find the students." Richard moved to his desk and picked up a thick folder. "I did some research on you this morning, Miss Johnson," he said, his voice now taking on a sharper, more analytical edge. "I wanted to understand who the person was who..." He hesitated, as if the words themselves were a betrayal. "Danced with my son." He opened the folder. On top was a grainy, printed photo of a rundown community center, a faded sign above the door reading "Freedom Steps." "You founded this 6 years ago," he stated. Diana sat up a little straighter. "I co-founded it with my sister Zoe." She watched him, her mind racing. "It's a dance and movement program for children with physical and developmental disabilities." Richard leafed through the next few pages, his expression unreadable. "A program which, according to these financial records, is about to close its doors permanently due to a lack of funding. Diana showed no surprise. Of course he would have found all of this out in less than 24 hours. A man like Richard Montgomery didn't just have money, he had information, and the power that came with it. I didn't come here to ask you for money, Mr. Montgomery. Then why did you come? Because you invited me, she replied simply. Richard laughed, a short, dry, joyless sound. Fair enough. He stood up again, pacing in front of the window, a caged tiger in an Armani suit. I want you to work for me. Diana blinked, genuinely taken aback for the first time. As a waitress, in your home. Richard's face hardened. As a therapeutic companion for Lucas. The way he said his son's name, it sounded like a diagnosis, a problem to be solved. Diana's eyes flickered to a silver-framed photograph on his desk. It showed a smiling, vibrant woman with kind eyes, holding a happy, laughing baby. Elizabeth, I have the best specialists in the country working with him, Richard continued, his voice a low, controlled monotone. Physical therapists from Johns Hopkins, neurologists from the Mayo Clinic, psychologists from Harvard. But what you did last night, he paused again, the words seeming to catch in his throat. It was just a dance, Mr. Montgomery. It was the first time I have seen my son smile since the accident, he said, the admission a raw, painful confession, dragged from the depths of his soul. I don't want a dancer for my son, Miss Johnson. I want someone who can do what you did. I want someone who knows how to follow, not lead. Diana studied the man before her. Beneath the billion-dollar facade, beneath the layers of power and control and arrogance, she saw something else, something she recognized all too well. A desperate, lost, and profoundly lonely father. I can pay you 5 times what you're making, at your 3 jobs combined, he said, the offer delivered as a closing argument, a final, irrefutable point. Diana stood up. No. Richard looked genuinely shocked, as if she had just slapped him. The word no was clearly not one he heard often. I don't work for people who see only my color or my social class before they see my competence, she explained calmly, her voice now imbued with a new, quiet power. And I most certainly do not work for people who believe they can buy solutions to their emotional problems. Richard's face flushed with a dark, angry red. You're turning down an offer that would solve all of your financial problems out of pride, out of dignity, Diana corrected him, and out of respect for your son. Lucas doesn't need another highly paid specialist to manage him. He needs space. He needs the freedom to lead his own life at his own pace. She walked to the door, then paused, her hand on the handle. You don't know my son, Richard said, his voice low and dangerous. No, Diana agreed, turning back to face him. But I know children like him. Children whose physical limitations are nothing compared to the invisible cages that the people who love them most often build around them. She reached into her worn purse and pulled out a simple, printed business card. She walked back and placed it on the polished surface of his massive desk. Freedom Steps. Our classes are on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 4 o'clock. If you'd ever like to bring Lucas by, the first class is free. As Diana walked out of the office, she passed Miss Winters, who had quite obviously been listening at the door. The assistant's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated disbelief. You just turned down Richard Montgomery, she whispered, as if Diana had just committed an act of sacrilege. Are you insane? Diana smiled, a genuine, mysterious, and deeply satisfied smile. Maybe, she said, but I'd rather be crazy on my own terms than be sane on someone else's. The war had been declared, the first moves made, and Richard Montgomery, the man who controlled empires, had no idea that he was about to be drawn into a battle for his own soul, a battle he was not remotely prepared to fight. The following Wednesday, a black Bentley, so polished it seemed to absorb the gritty reality of the surrounding neighborhood, glided to a stop outside a dilapidated community warehouse in the Bronx. The building was a relic from another era, its brick facade covered in a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of graffiti, its windows reinforced with wire mesh. A hand-painted sign, faded and peeling but still full of a defiant cheer, hung above the double doors. Freedom Steps. Inside the car, Richard Montgomery stared at the building as if it were an alien artifact. His hands, usually so decisive, were clenched on the steering wheel. He wore casual slacks and a cashmere sweater, a desperate and transparent attempt to blend in, but he might as well have been wearing a crown and royal robes. He looked utterly, profoundly out of place. This was a world he did not know, a world he had spent his entire life building walls to keep out. In the back seat, Lucas was vibrating with an energy Richard hadn't seen in 2 years. He was pressed against the window, his eyes wide, taking in the scene. Through the warehouse's large, grimy windows, they could see shapes moving inside children. Children in wheelchairs, children with walkers, children with prosthetic limbs, and they were dancing. "He's not coming in," said Zoe Johnson, Diana's younger sister and the co-founder of Freedom Steps. She stood with Diana just inside the entrance, watching the silent drama unfold in the Bentley. Zoe, a whirlwind of passionate energy with a master's in social work and a hijab that was always slightly askew, had a healthy skepticism of men like Richard Montgomery. "Men like him," she whispered to Diana, "they don't set foot in places like this. They write checks from a safe distance. It's a photo op at best." Diana smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Don't underestimate the power of a determined son," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the boy in the back seat. As they watched, the back door of the Bentley opened. Lucas emerged, moving slowly, deliberately, his braces cumbersome on the uneven pavement. He looked towards the warehouse, his expression a mixture of terror and longing. Then, to Zoe's utter astonishment, the driver's side door opened. Richard Montgomery got out. He stood for a long moment, a titan of industry looking lost and vulnerable on a cracked Bronx sidewalk. He looked at the building, at the children inside, at his own son, and seemed to fight a silent, internal battle. Finally, with a deep, resigned breath, he walked around the car and took his son's hand. "I told you he'd come," Diana said, more to herself than to her sister. "What did you do?" Zoe stared at her, mystified. "What did you say to him?" Diana didn't answer. She simply opened the door to the warehouse, a welcoming smile on her face. In her small apartment, hidden beneath her bed, was a notebook. It was filled with years of research, notes on non-directive therapeutic approaches, grant proposals that had been rejected time and time again, and a detailed, ambitious plan for a revolutionary new kind of rehabilitation center. What Richard Montgomery couldn't possibly know was that he hadn't just been invited to a dance class. He had been summoned to an audition, and the role he was auditioning for was that of a father. Freedom Steps operated on a shoestring budget and an abundance of love. The cavernous warehouse space was filled with handmade posters, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the grim, industrial surroundings. "Your rhythm, your rules, every move counts. There are no mistakes, only new steps." To the sound of a light, infectious beat, a dozen children were exploring the space. A girl in a brightly decorated wheelchair was spinning in perfect, joyful circles. A boy with a single prosthetic leg was experimenting with a sequence of hops and balances, a look of intense concentration on his face. Another child, with cerebral palsy, was moving on the floor, her movements fluid and expressive, a form of breakdancing all her own. "Mr. Montgomery, welcome," Diana said, her voice warm and professional. She knelt down to be at eye level with Lucas. "Lucas, we're so glad you could make it. Would you like to join us?" The boy nodded enthusiastically, but his eyes darted to his father, a silent question. "Go on," Richard said, his voice tight, uncomfortable. I'll be right here." As Diana gently guided Lucas toward the group, Zoe approached Richard, a folding chair in her hand. "The first day is always the hardest," she commented, her tone a mixture of sympathy and challenge. "For the parents, I mean, not the kids." "This isn't therapy," Richard stated, his voice defensive. "I've hired the best rehabilitation specialists in the world for my son." "And how has that been working out for him?" Zoe asked gently, her question a quiet, devastating counterpoint. Before Richard could formulate a response, the studio door opened again. An older woman entered, leaning lightly on an ornate silver-handled cane. She had hair the color of steel, braided elegantly, and a commanding presence that seemed to fill the room. She moved through the space with a familiar grace, greeting several of the children by name. "Dr. Elaine Mercer," Zoe whispered to Richard, enjoying the look of dawning confusion on his face. "Retired head of neuroscience at Harvard Medical School, specializing in brain plasticity and motor skill development in children." The woman's sharp eyes found Richard. She walked towards him, her gaze direct and unflinching. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, her voice crisp and clear, "you've rejected my research grant proposal 3 times in the past 2 years." "Dr. Mercer," Richard stammered, clearly off balance. I had no idea you were involved with this place. I oversee the research program," she explained, her tone matter. "We are conducting a long-term study on how non-directive autonomous movement affects neural reconfiguration in children with significant motor challenges. The results, I might add, are groundbreaking." "Research," Richard frowned, the gears in his powerful mind beginning to turn, to connect the dots. I thought this was just a community dance class. It was Diana who answered. She had returned, leaving Lucas happily exploring his own movements with the girl in the wheelchair. Freedom Steps is a pilot motor rehabilitation program, she explained, her voice calm and professional. It's based on the theory of movement autonomy. We integrate adaptive dance techniques with neuroscientific principles to encourage the brain to find new pathways around physical limitations. The penny dropped. The full, staggering scope of the situation finally became clear to him. You were Dr. Mercer's research assistant on the proposals, he said, his voice flat. Co-author, Dr. Mercer corrected him sharply. Diana's master's degree is incomplete only because she had to leave the program to care for her sister when she fell ill, but her theoretical work on the subject is, without question, revolutionary. You knew, Richard said, his eyes locking onto Diana's. You knew who I was at the restaurant. From the moment you walked in, Diana confirmed, her gaze steady. And when Lucas stood up to dance, I recognized the opportunity, an opportunity to show you what our work could do, rather than just telling you. Was it staged? The dance, he asked, the question a last, desperate attempt to reclaim some semblance of control, to believe that he had not been so completely and utterly out. Absolutely not, Diana said, her voice softening slightly. Lucas chose to get up. I simply chose to follow. At that moment, as if on cue, a group of people entered the warehouse. They carried cameras and microphones. Richard tensed immediately. And what's this? Part 2 of your plan. Diana smiled, a small, enigmatic smile. Zoe handed Richard a copy of a freshly printed scientific journal. On the cover was an article titled, Revolutionary Motor Rehabilitation Methodology Shows Promising Results in Pediatric Cases. We published our first peer-reviewed results today, Dr. Mercer explained calmly, and we invited the press to help us raise awareness for our work, and for our funding crisis. You used my son, Richard said, his voice pure ice. You used my son for a public relations stunt. Diana said nothing. She simply led him to a small quiet room at the side of the warehouse. The walls were covered in photographs, dozens of them. Children dancing, laughing, moving. Beneath each photo was a small handwritten card, detailing their progress, their small victories, their first steps. On the far wall there was a single, empty picture frame. What's that? He asked. Our future, Diana replied softly. The full-scale state-of-the-art rehabilitation center we could build if we had the resources. A center that could help 500 children a year, instead of just 50. You orchestrated all of this, Richard muttered. A statement of grudging, horrified admiration. The dance. The meeting. Bringing me here, on this day. I saw an opportunity to get your attention, Mr. Montgomery, she said. 4 months ago, when you cancelled our grant meeting without even bothering to read the proposal. A proposal I had spent 2 years of my life developing. I made a promise to these children that I would find another way. You provided that way, Diana. Zoe, Dr. Mercer's voice, sharp with alarm, called from the main room. They rushed back out. A hush had fallen over the studio. The music had stopped. The children had formed a loose, silent circle. In the center was Lucas. He had done something extraordinary. He had, with painstaking effort, unfastened the brace on his right leg. He was standing, shakily, on just his left leg, his right foot hovering, trembling, just above the floor. Lucas, Richard started forward, a wave of panic and instinct washing over him. Diana put a firm hand on his arm, stopping him. Wait, she whispered, watch him. Lucas took a deep, shuddering breath. His small face was a mask of pure, intense concentration. He was no longer a boy in a warehouse. He was a warrior facing his greatest enemy, his own broken body. He focused, his eyes fixed on a point on the far wall, and then, to the collective, stunned silence of everyone in the room, he took a step, a full, complete, unassisted step with his right leg. It was small, it was shaky. It was the most beautiful thing Richard Montgomery had ever seen. The children erupted in cheers. The camera flashes from the reporters exploded like a string of firecrackers in Richard's face, the face that was famous for its unreadable, emotionless composure. Crumpled, he stood, a titan of industry, a master of the universe, with tears streaming unashamedly down his cheeks. That, Diana said softly, her voice filled with a quiet, profound triumph, is why we created Freedom Steps. It's not about the perfect steps, Mr. Montgomery, it's about the first ones. Richard watched his son, not as a problem to be managed, not as a source of his own pain and frustration, but as a complete, courageous, and utterly magnificent human being, discovering his own strength, on his own terms. The reporter from the New York Times approached him, a microphone extended. "Mr. Montgomery," she asked, her voice gentle but persistent, "could you comment on your presence here today? Is it true that your foundation has repeatedly rejected funding for this program?" Richard Montgomery, the man who controlled markets, who built empires, who never ever admitted a mistake, was cornered. Before him lay two paths. He could retreat into his anger, his pride, his power, confirming to the world his reputation as a cold, calculating, heartless man, or he could do the one thing he had never done in his entire life. He could surrender. He could learn to follow. His gaze shifted from the waiting reporters to his smiling, triumphant son. The orchestra of power and privilege he had conducted his entire life was now playing a different tune, and he had to decide, in this one, profound, life-altering moment, whether he would continue to be the conductor, or if he would finally have the courage to learn how to dance.